The fog had thinned by the time Mara opened her notebook again. It had not gone altogether. Beyond the citrus house panes, the garden was still softened to a pale wash of shapes, but the nearest paths showed through more clearly than before. A low edge of stone appeared beside the entrance walk. The rail along the glass walk held a narrow line of moisture. The lamps made smaller pools against the whitening air. Mara sat at the table with the notebook before her and the keys beside the bowl of oranges. The familiar keys had been resting there while she looked over the lines she had written during the night. The first lamps, the fig leaf. The soil at the edge of the bed, cool and dark beneath her fingertip. There was room below the last entry, she wrote. Final round. The words were plain, but they gave the next part of the shift its shape. She closed the notebook, tucked the pencil through its spine, and sat for another moment with her hands resting on the wooden table. The citrus house held the same mild warmth it had held throughout the night. Around her, the orange trees were still and neatly spaced in their tubs. Their leaves caught the lamplight with a dull green shine. A few oranges remained in the bowl, round and warm-colored against the wood. The watering can stood where it belonged, near the nearer wall. Nothing in the room hurried her to begin. Mara looked through the glass toward the garden. The fog lay low among the beds, leaving a quiet border around the conservatory. The nearest gravel had begun to show through it, darkened by moisture, and a pale thread of daylight rested above the hedge. Morning was still some distance from the doors. For now, the glass house remained a night place, tended by lamps and small adjustments. She slipped the notebook into the pocket of her cardigan. The keys followed. Their labeled tags settled into a soft, contained weight against the wool. She knew their order better now, though she still liked the useful feel of the labels between her fingers. They belonged to the work in the same way as the pencil, the watering can, and the small signs beside the plants. Each was there to make an ordinary task clear. Mara stood and pushed in her chair. She did not begin by checking the room. The final round had only just started, and there was no need to turn the first step into the last. Instead, she remained beside the table and let her eyes move once along the path she would take. Between the citrus tubs, the floor led toward the far panes, and then back to the door. Beyond that door lay the cooler glass walk with its lamps, its narrow bench, the folded canvas cloth, and the two clay pots in their tray. Farther along, the fig house and potting room waited in their familiar air. The route no longer needed to be imagined one room at a time. It joined together easily in her mind. Still, Mara gave her attention only to the place where she stood. She walked to the bowl and turned it slightly, not to improve it, but because one orange rested against the rim. When the bowl moved, the fruit settled into a looser arrangement, with a soft touch of peel against peel. Mara let it remain that way. She passed the watering can without lifting it. Its handle faced outward. The tray beneath it looked dry. Neither needed attention before the round began. At the nearest tree, a low leaf curved toward the path. Mara bent just enough to see that it hung freely and was not caught against the edge of the tub. The leaf needed nothing from her. She straightened and continued. The floor beneath her shoes was clear. The tubs sat evenly on their trays. The soil in the nearest one was dark without looking wet. She did not touch it. Earlier work had taught her that not every check required a hand or a tool. Sometimes seeing a room as it was provided all that was needed. At the far end, she paused beside the glass wall. Outside, the garden beds emerged and faded beneath the low fog. The change was so gradual that no single moment could be called brighter than the one before it. A stone edge became visible, then a little more of the path. Moisture gathered on the rail and along the lower panes, holding the lamps in faint reflections. Mara could also see her own softened outline in the glass. Cardigan, dark hair, one hand resting loosely at her side. Behind that reflection stood the small orange trees and the table where the notebook had been. The room looked settled, but the round had only begun. That distinction pleased her. Beginning a final route did not mean rushing toward the end of it. There were still rooms to enter, temperatures to feel, paths to look along, and lamps to leave steady while the night remained. Each part could arrive in its own order. Mara turned back toward the door. As she walked between the trees, the keys moved lightly in her pocket. Their tags made no more than a muted touch against one another. The sound followed the pace of her steps and then stopped when she stopped. At the table, she glanced at the chair she had pushed in. The bowl of oranges rested near its center. The wood held the warm light without glare. She placed her fingertips briefly against the chair back, then let her hand fall. The citrus house door stood at its usual opening. Mara approached it without adjusting it yet. Cooler air reached through the narrow space and rested lightly on her face. It carried the mild dampness of the glass walk, different from the warmer scents of soil, leaves, and orange peel behind her. Through the opening, she could see the first lamp nearest the citrus house. Beyond it waited the narrow bench, pale beneath the glass. The folded canvas cloth showed one clean edge on its shelf. Farther along, the midpoint lamp made another amber circle on the floor. The corridor was quiet and clear. Mara took the notebook out once more, opened it to the words she had written, and read them without adding anything. Final round. That was enough. It named the work without claiming that any part of it had already been done. She returned the pencil to the notebook's spine and slipped the cover back into her pocket. Then she rested one hand on the citrus house door and moved it only as much as she needed to pass. The cooler air gathered around her as she stepped into the glass walk. Behind her, the citrus house kept its mild warmth, its orange trees, its bowl of fruit, and the watering can near the wall. Ahead, the lamps continued in their familiar sequence through the thinning fog light. Mara adjusted the door to its usual small opening and began the final round at an unhurried pace. At the citrus house threshold, Mara paused with the notebook in her pocket. The final round had begun, but it was still only a beginning. The entrance door remained closed in its usual overnight state, and the lamps along the glass walk continued to hold their warm circles against the slowly gathering daylight. She turned toward the glass walk. The nearest lamp shone more gently than it had earlier. Daylight had gathered along the panes, turning the fog beyond them from silver gray to a thin, pearly white. The lamp had not become unnecessary, but it no longer seemed to hold the corridor together alone. Mara walked toward the entrance hall, with one hand resting lightly over the keys in her cardigan pocket. The bench appeared where it always did, its wooden seat pale beneath the changing light. The folded canvas cloth remained on the shelf. Beside it, one clean edge turned outward. The clay pots stood in their tray, dry and even, their rims catching a faint shine. Mara looked down the length of the corridor before she continued. It was clear from the citrus house to the entrance hall, and clear in the other direction, toward the fig house. At the beginning of the night, each room and passage had seemed to ask separately for her attention. Now they were beginning to belong to one sequence. She knew where the floor changed beneath her shoes, where a door was usually left open, where the light cooled, and where it warmed. At the entrance hall, she stopped on the dark blue tiles. The outer door was still latched. Through its glass, the covered threshold showed clearly, and beyond it, the nearest part of the garden path had emerged from the thinning fog. Mara did not lift the latch yet. That belonged later in the opening checklist, when the rest of the round had been completed. For now, she checked the mat. Its edges lay flat. A little moisture had darkened the fibers nearest the door, but there was no curled corner and no gravel scattered across the tiles. She ran the side of her shoe lightly along the nearest edge, confirming that it rested evenly against the floor. Then she looked up at the notice board. The papers remained clipped in place. The labeled switches beneath them were unchanged, and every lamp named there was still on. Mara took the notebook from her pocket and opened it to the line she had written in the citrus house. Final round. Beneath it, she added 2 small marks beside the first items on the checklist. Entrance path visible. Matte flat. She closed the notebook and returned it to her pocket. 2 checks were finished. The others could wait for their proper place in the route. Mara turned back toward the citrus house. The nearest amber lamp remained steady above her. Its circle of light rested on the floor, though morning had softened its edges. She passed the bench again, noticing without touching that the canvas cloth had not slipped forward and that the tray of clay pots remained square beneath the window. At the citrus house door, she paused. The familiar opening remained between the door and its frame. Warm air touched her face as she stepped through. The small orange trees stood in their tubs along the path, their leaves still and glossy. The bowl on the table held several oranges, and the watering can waited near the wall. Mara went first to the table. Her chair was tucked in. The notebook had left a faint rectangle where it had rested earlier, but there was nothing untidy about it. She ran one finger along the chair back, then let her hand fall. The room did not need to be made impressive for the morning. It only needed to be itself. Warm, orderly, and open enough for someone to come in from the cool garden air and look at the trees when the doors were opened. Later, she walked between the tubs. The trays beneath them sat level. The floor was clean. A low leaf near the nearest orange tree curved toward the path without touching it, and Mara bent slightly to see that it was not caught on anything. It was simply growing as leaves did. She straightened again. At the watering can, she crouched just enough to look across the tray beneath it. The surface was dry, the handle faced outward, and the spout pointed away from the path. She did not move it. That made another completed check. At the far glass wall, the garden was more visible than before. The path outside ran between wet borders, its pale gravel darkened by the night's moisture. The fog still lay close to the ground, but it had thinned into a soft brightness that made the nearest stones and rails easy to see. Mara stood there for a moment, because the view had become part of the round. The glass held faint reflections of the lamps behind her. Orange leaves, table edge, lamp glow, pale garden. All of it rested together in the pane. When she turned back, the citrus house looked settled. She took out the notebook near the table and added 2 more small marks: citrus path clear, watering dry. There were still blank lines below them. Mara liked seeing the work take shape that way. Not as one declaration made too early, but as a row of ordinary facts gathered at an unhurried pace. She adjusted the door by the smallest amount, returning it to the opening she had seen at the start of the shift. Then she stepped into the glass walk again. The air there was cooler, but no longer cold. Its freshness made the warmth of the citrus house feel distinct, without making either room seem separate from the other. Mara passed by the midpoint lamp and looked up at it. The amber bulb was steady. She checked its small label, though she already knew what it said. Glass walk. The letters were plain and useful. Mara had begun the night by reading every label carefully. Now the labels felt less like instructions and more like companions to the work. They helped, but they did not need to explain everything. She left the lamp on. Daylight had begun to share the corridor with it, but the fog was still thick enough beyond the farther panes that there was no reason to change the lighting yet. The checklist named the lamps near its end. Mara would return to them when the rooms had been checked and the morning had gathered a little more fully. At the fig house door, she saw the greenish light through the familiar narrow opening. Inside, the beds and larger leaves had begun to take on their morning colors. The lamps still made. The leaves looked deep and cool, while daylight showed along their edges. The young fig plant stood among the others, its new leaf open and quiet near the top of its slender stem. Mara followed the path around the bed. She checked the floor first. It was dry and free of soil. Then she looked at the watering can on its tray, upright and unchanged. At the edge of the bed, the small marker remained easy to read. New leaf expected after evening warmth. Mara smiled a little at the note. The new leaf no longer felt like something that required close watching. It had become an ordinary part of the plant's shape, one pale green leaf among many darker ones. She did not touch the soil. She did not measure the leaf. Those were not tasks for this part of the round. Instead, she followed the curve of the path and made sure that no leaf reached so far into it that a morning visitor would brush against it. The path remained clear. Near the potting room doorway, she looked in at the work table. The brush stood in its jar with the bristles upward. The clay pots remained in short stacks. The table was clear except for the things that belonged there. Mara took one step into the room, enough to look at the far corners and the shelf beneath the table, then stepped back again. Everything there was in order, but she did not turn that observation into a larger conclusion. The potting room was one room on the route. The entrance latch, the remaining rooms, and the lamps still belonged to later parts of the checklist. She opened the notebook once more. Fig house path clear. Potting table clear. The page now held a short line of completed checks beneath the words final round. It was observable progress, no more and no less. Mara ran her eye over the marks, then closed the cover. She returned to the fig house door and left it at its usual opening. The room behind her held its calm green light, gentled by the growing day, but still useful among the broad leaves. On the way back through the glass walk, Mara noticed that the lamps had begun to look warmer than the air around them. Their circles of light were still visible on the floor, while the panes above had become pale enough to carry the first reflection of the sky. Soon, perhaps, the lamps could be switched off in their ordinary order. Not yet. Mara stopped at the bench and sat for a moment. The wood was cool beneath her, and the folded canvas cloth remained on the shelf beside her. Through the glass, the damp garden path appeared and faded where the last low bands of fog crossed it. She could feel the shape of the unfinished route without needing to hurry through it. Several practical checks were behind her now. The entrance mat, the visible path, the citrus floor and watering tray, the fig house path, the potting table. Ahead were the other established rooms, the final look along the connecting paths, the lamps, and the entrance latch. The conservatory was not yet in its morning state. It was moving toward morning by small degrees, just as the light outside was moving through the fog. Mara rested her hands loosely in her lap and listened to the quiet steadiness of the lamps above her. After a moment, she stood. She slipped the notebook securely into her pocket, felt the labeled keys settle beside it, and turned toward the next part of the route. Behind her, the citrus house held its mild warmth. Ahead, the glass walk continued beneath its amber lamps, with the remaining checks waiting in their familiar order. Mara stood from the bench and turned toward the next part of the route. The notebook remained closed in her pocket. Several lines had been marked beneath final round, but the checklist was not complete. The other established rooms still waited for their ordinary checks, and the lamps and entrance latch belonged later, when the morning had gathered a little more fully. For now, the entrance door remained closed and latched. Through the glass walk, the fog had begun to thin. It lay low over the borders and softened the far edge of the path, but the nearer gravel showed clearly. Drops of moisture held along the iron rail, each one pale where the growing daylight reached it. The garden looked rinsed rather than changed. The lamps continued in their proper places above Mara. Their amber circles were fainter than they had been earlier, no longer dividing the corridor into light and shadow so clearly. Daylight had begun to join them in one long, even stretch. It touched the bench, the shelf with its folded canvas cloth, the tray of clay pots beneath the window, and the familiar thresholds along the walk. Mara had expected the changing light to make the building feel different. It did, but not in a way that required adjustment. The rooms simply showed themselves more plainly. She rested one hand over the notebook in her pocket and looked along the passage. The final round had seemed longer when she wrote its name on the page. She had pictured it as a careful return through each room, with the checklist guiding her from one item to the next. That was still what it was. Yet the route no longer felt like a set of separate instructions. At the bench, the canvas cloth was still folded on the shelf. Its clean edge faced outward exactly as it had earlier. The clay pots stood beneath the window, their rims dull in the mixed lamp and morning light. Mara had noticed each of these things before, but during the night they had belonged to separate moments. The bench when she had paused, the cloth when she had checked the shelf, the pots when she had passed from one room to another. Now they seemed less like individual reminders. They belonged to the route. Mara smiled at the thought, though it was not a grand one. A route was simply a route. A door, a bench, a lamp, a turn in the path, a room with its particular temperature. But the conservatory no longer felt like a set of places she was borrowing for a night. She knew how the spaces met. She knew what was meant to be left open and what was meant to be put back. She knew where the floor gave a little under the matting near the fig house, and where the glass walk carried the faintest scent of damp leaves after rain. She did not need to write any of that down. The realization came quietly enough that she almost continued walking without naming it. She was becoming confident here. Not finished with the shift, and not certain that she had learned every small habit of the building. She still had rooms to check, lamps to switch off when the time was right, and the entrance latch to lift for morning. But she no longer needed the checklist to tell her where she was. She could feel the shape of the route around her and understand what came next. The confidence was modest. It did not make the work smaller or less deserving of care. It only made her attention feel steadier. At the citrus house door, she checked the familiar opening between the door and its frame. It was unchanged. Warm air reached her face, carrying the mild green scent of leaves and soil, with the cleaner brightness of the oranges from the bowl on the table. Inside, the small orange trees stood along the path in their tubs. Their leaves had begun to lose the glossy, lamplit look of the night and take on a softer, steadier green. A few oranges caught the morning light with a quiet weight of color. Mara walked to the table and looked at the chair. It was tucked in. The surface was clear. The faint rectangle left by her notebook had nearly disappeared into the ordinary grain of the wood. The watering can remained by the wall, its handle turned outward, ready for the next person who had a reason to use it. Nothing in the room asked her to rearrange it. She stood beside the nearest orange tree and looked down at the leaves that curved toward the path. Earlier, she had bent to make sure one low leaf was free. It still was. She did not need to look beneath it again. Her first glance had been enough, and the room had remained settled since then. That, more than the remembered order of the keys or the familiar turn of the path, made her recognize the change in herself. She was learning the difference between noticing and worrying. There would always be ordinary things to notice. A leaf growing toward the light, a cloth folded differently after use. Rain making the garden paths darker than they had been the evening before. Attention belonged to her work. Repeating every check did not. She could see a thing clearly, decide whether it needed her, and let it remain itself when it did not. Mara rested her fingertips briefly against the smooth rim of an empty pot near the wall. Then she withdrew her hand and left the citrus house as she had found it, with the door set at its small, usual opening. The glass walk felt brighter on her way back. The panes held more of the pale sky now, though the lamps were still lit above them. The bench and shelf made their small, familiar arrangement. At the midpoint, Mara glanced up at the lamp label. Glasswalk. The label did not tell her anything new. It did not have to. Its plain letters gave her a simple pleasure, like seeing a name written neatly where it belonged. She left the lamp steady and continued. At the fig house door, the narrow opening admitted a cool, leafy smell. Mara went in and followed the path around the bed. The larger fig leaves made a loose canopy overhead. In the mingled light, their greens were varied rather than deep. Some silvery at the veins, some dark at the edges, some almost yellow where the daylight thinned through them. The young fig plant stood among the older leaves with its new leaf open near the top of the slender stem. Mara paused beside the marker. New leaf expected after evening warmth. She read it without leaning close. The words were easy to see. The leaf was easy to see too. It had already begun to look like part of the room, no more demanding than the watering can on its tray or the dry, swept path around the bed. She thought of how carefully she had looked at it during the night. That care had been right then. It had helped her understand what the note meant and how the plant belonged among the others. Now the same care meant leaving it alone. The potting room doorway stood open beside her. Mara looked in. The brush was upright in its jar. Clay pots were stacked in their short, even columns. The work table was clear, except for the things that belonged on it. The growing daylight made the room look less like a place waiting for instruction and more like a place prepared for ordinary use. She did not step inside. She had already checked the corners and the shelf beneath the table during this round. They had been in order then, and nothing suggested that another look was needed. Mara took the notebook from her pocket. She opened it to the checklist and read the short line of completed checks. The entrance path was visible. The mat lay flat. The citrus path and watering tray were in order. The fig house path was clear. The potting table was clear. Below those marks, other items still waited. The remaining rooms, the lamps, the entrance latch. Seeing the blank spaces did not weaken the small confidence she had felt. It made that confidence more useful. She knew what she had done, and she knew what she had not done yet. There was no need to confuse familiarity with completion. Mara returned the pencil to the notebook's spine and closed the cover. When she stepped back into the glass walk, the lamps still made their softened amber circles along the floor. The fog beyond the panes continued to thin without disappearing. The entrance hall waited at one end of the passage, its outer door still closed in its overnight state. The next part of the route waited in the other direction. Mara stood at the midpoint for a moment, with the notebook in one pocket and the labeled keys in the other. She did not need to prove her growing confidence by hurrying ahead. It was enough to recognize the place around her, to know which work was settled, and to continue toward the work that remained. Then she turned at an unhurried pace and followed the familiar path into the next part of the round. Mara stood at the midpoint of the glass walk, with the notebook closed in one pocket and the labeled keys resting in the other. Behind her, the citrus house, fig house, and potting room had received their ordinary checks. The entrance path was visible through the thinning fog, and the mat lay flat against the blue tiles. Ahead, the remaining rooms waited in their familiar order. The lamps were still on. The entrance door was still closed and latched. Mara let those facts remain as they were. First came the rooms she had not yet checked. After that, when the daylight had gathered more fully, she could switch off the lamps in sequence. The entrance latch belonged later still. She turned toward the fern hall. The air changed before she reached it. The glass walk's coolness deepened into the damp, green air of the ferns. Moisture rested along the lower panes. Beneath the roof, the lamps gave the fronds a quiet amber edge. while morning light showed their upper surfaces in softer shades of green. The floor mats lay flat at every corner. Mara looked along the drainage edge beside the path. It was clear, holding only a faint shine. She did not repeat the slower watering route from the earlier shift. The soil remained settled, and the leaves carried enough moisture of their own. This part of the work required looking rather than adding. A broad frond leaned over the path near the turn. Mara placed 2 fingers beneath its stem and guided it lightly back toward the bed. It stayed there, resting against the other leaves. Farther on, a mat had collected a few pale crumbs of dried soil along its edge. Mara brushed them together, gathered them into her palm, and returned them to the bed, where they disappeared against the damp earth. The mat looked much as it had before, except cleaner. That seemed right to her. The best parts of the work did not need to announce themselves. She looked back along the Fernhall path. The fronds rested within the beds. The drainage edge was clear. The mats lay flat. Mara took out the notebook. Fern path clear, drainage clear. She added the marks without turning them into a conclusion. There were rooms still ahead, and the lamps were still on. The seed library lay beyond the fern hall, quieter and drier. The damp green scent gave way to paper, wood, and the faint dry earthiness that clung to the labeled drawers. Nothing stood open. At the table, the returned notebook remained in its proper place. Mrs. Sado's careful pages had already explained what they needed to explain. The different rooms required different kinds of care through the night, and the conservatory's quiet spaces had become useful to people as well as plants. There was no question left inside the closed cover. Mara touched one corner of the notebook, making sure it lay fully on the table. A pencil rested beside it. She turned the pencil a little so that it lay parallel with the notebook's spine. One drawer label had lifted slightly at a corner. Mara pressed it flat with her thumb and held it for a moment. When she took her hand away, it remained smooth. The drawer itself stayed closed. There was no reason to open it merely to prove that it had been checked. Mara opened her own notebook. Seed drawers closed. Table clear. From the seed library, the established passage led toward the small stair for the observatory roof. Mara followed it at the same even pace. The keys shifted softly in her cardigan, their labeled tags making a muted touch with each step. At the top, the observatory room held the coolest air of the route. The roof remained closed above her. Its fittings sat quiet and still, and the visitor register rested where it had been left. Mara looked first at the roof indicator. It showed the closed position plainly. The space around the mechanism was clear. The handle was in its proper resting place, and the room required no adjustment. The observatory did not feel like a place waiting for the sky to change. It was simply a small public room beneath a closed roof, ready for another ordinary evening when the weather and schedule allowed it. The thin cloud beyond the glass was morning weather now, soft and pale, with no task attached to it. Mara walked once around the central space. The path was clear, the register was closed, the roof was settled. She added the next marks. Observatory roof closed, floor clear. The remaining blank lines had grown fewer, but she did not write rooms ready. That would be true only after the lighting checks. Mara began the way back. She passed through the dry quiet near the seed library without touching the returned notebook or pencil again. At the fern hall, the frond she had moved rested among the other leaves. The mats lay flat. A thin line of moisture showed in the drainage edge, moving where it was meant to move. The daylight was stronger now. It reached farther beneath the leaves. The lamps still glowed, but their pools no longer held the path together. Beyond the fern hall, the glass walk was clear. The warmer opening of the citrus house remained visible, and the fig house held its cooler green. Now the lamps could be switched off. Mara returned to the nearest labeled switch. She read the name before touching it, Fern Hall. She pressed the switch. The amber light faded, leaving the fronds in the soft gray-green of morning. The room did not become dim. Its details remained clear. The flat mats, the clean path, the layered leaves, the narrow drainage edge. At each following switch, Mara read the label, looked along the space it served, and turned the light off only after confirming that daylight was sufficient. Seed library. The warm glow withdrew from the rows of drawers. Pale light from the glass settled over their labels and across the closed notebook on the table. The floor and the route between the drawers remained clearly visible. Observatory passage. The stair remained easy to see after the lamp went out. Its edges were plain in the growing morning. Glass walk. The amber circles along the floor disappeared, replaced by a continuous band of daylight beneath the panes. The corridor kept its familiar shape. The bench, folded canvas cloth, and tray of clay pots remained clearly visible. At the bench, Mara paused beside the shelf. One corner of the cloth sat a little nearer the edge than the others. She eased it back into line. Below the window, the clay pots remained in their tray, their rims catching the morning light. She continued along the lighting route to the citrus house. At its threshold, she found the familiar labeled switch and read it before placing her fingers against it. Citrus house. Mara looked between the small orange trees. Daylight reached across the path, showing the tubs, their level trays, the watering can near the wall, and the bowl of oranges on the table. The route from the doorway to the far panes was clear. She pressed the switch. The lamp went out, and the mild warmth of the room remained unchanged. Morning light rested evenly on the leaves and floor. Mara looked once from the table to the doorway and confirmed that the entire path was still plainly visible. Then she crossed the glass walk toward the fig house. The daylight beneath the panes carried her easily to its familiar opening. Inside, the broad leaves had taken on their morning greens, and the young plant's new leaf showed clearly near the top of its slender stem. Mara read the label beside the switch, Fig House. She looked around the curve of the path. The bed edge, the watering can on its tray, the small plant marker, and the opening toward the potting room were all distinct in the daylight. She turned the lamp off. The deeper green cast of the lamp faded, but the fig house path remained clear from end to end. The broad leaves were easy to see without it, and the route back to the glass walk remained open and familiar. Mara returned through the glass walk toward the entrance hall. Behind her, the citrus house and fig house paths remained clearly visible in daylight. The fern hall, seed library, observatory passage, and glass walk were also lit well enough for morning, with every established lamp now off except the one above the blue tiles. Its light had become faint against the clear shape of the outer door and the pale garden beyond it. Mara went to the small metal plate beneath the notice board and read the final label. Entrance hall. She turned it off. Daylight settled evenly across the tiles. It gathered near the glass of the door, along the lower edge of the notice board, and over the labeled switches. The hall remained quiet and clear. Mara looked back along the route once more. The glass walk was fully visible. Beyond it, the citrus house path remained warm and clear, and the fig house path held its quiet green without the lamps. Every established room light was off, and every connecting path could still be seen plainly. Only then did Mara take out her notebook and open it on the narrow ledge. The checks she had made formed a plain sequence down the page. Entrance, mat, citrus house, fig house, potting room, fern hall, seed library, observatory. Beneath them, she added one more line, lamps off. She read the list from the beginning. Every room had been checked. The paths were clear. The drainage edge was clear. The observatory roof was closed. The lighting checks were complete. Only the entrance opening remained. Mara did not write that the work was complete. She did not add a note for Elias, and she did not touch the outer latch. The door stood closed in its overnight state, holding its place at the final boundary of the checklist. She returned the pencil to the notebook's spine and slipped the cover into her pocket. The keys settled beside it with their familiar weight. Behind her, the conservatory held its morning light without the lamps. The fern hall kept its damp green air. The seed library waited with its drawers closed and its returned notebook on the table. The observatory roof rested in the closed position. The fig house, potting room, and citrus house remained as she had left them, their paths clearly visible. Ahead of her, the outer door waited for its one ordinary change. Mara stood on the blue tiles, calm and unhurried, with the completed route behind her and the entrance still properly closed. Mara stood on the dark blue tiles, calm and unhurried, with the completed route behind her and the entrance still properly closed. The outer door remained latched in its overnight state. Through the glass, she could see the covered threshold, the pale gravel path, and the garden beyond. The fog had thinned until it was only a mild softness near the hedge. The nearest border showed dark soil between its leaves. A little moisture remained on the path, but its curve toward the gate was clear. Only the entrance opening remained. Mara did not reach for the latch yet. Instead, she turned from the door and looked back along the glass walk. Without the lamps, the passage held a cooler, paler morning. The long panes gathered the colorless light from above and laid it evenly across the dry path. At the far end, the citrus house doorway showed a warmer shade among the glass and leaves. There was no need to repeat the checks she had already made. The fern hall mats were flat. The drainage edge was clear. The seed library drawers were closed, and the returned notebook rested on the table beside its pencil. The observatory roof was in its settled position. The fig house path was clear. The potting room work table was ready for the day's ordinary use. Mara could gather those facts without walking back into every room. Still, before she prepared the handover, she wanted to take the last route from the entrance hall to the citrus house and back. It was not another inspection. It was simply the return path itself, the familiar line joining the rooms she had tended through the night. She put one hand into her cardigan pocket and felt the ring of keys. The labeled tags rested together, light against her fingers. She knew their names without sorting through them. She knew the small difference between the warmth of the citrus house and the cooler air beyond its doorway. She knew where the bench stood, how the fig house opening felt as she passed it, and how the dark blue tiles of the entrance hall waited at the end of the walk. The knowledge was ordinary. It had come from walking the same short routes, opening and closing what needed to be opened and closed, noticing what was meant to be noticed, and leaving the rest in peace. Mara stepped into the glass walk. Morning had settled more fully over the panes. The fine damp marks along the lower glass had begun to fade, though a few still caught the light when she passed them. Above, the roof showed a broad, pale brightness that made the leaves on either side seem deep and collected. The path under her shoes was dry and familiar. At the bench, she slowed but did not stop. The folded canvas cloth remained on its shelf, and she was content to know it there. The clay pots by the window made their low, quiet shapes against the daylight. One still carried its faint dusting of old soil, a useful trace of the work for which it was kept. Nothing invited her hand. Nothing needed to. As she walked, she became aware of how different the conservatory sounded in the morning. During the night, the smallest noises had seemed distinct. The soft movement of her shoes, the brush against a mat, the quiet click of a switch. Now the building held those sounds more loosely. The glass walk seemed to contain the hush of the garden, as well as its own stillness. Beyond the panes, damp gravel lay along the outer paths, and the hedge had begun to show its ordinary green through the thinning fog. At the fig house opening, Mara slowed only enough to feel the cooler air touch her face. She could see the broad leaves through the doorway, layered beneath the glass. Among them, the young plant held its new leaf open near the top of its slender stem. The leaf no longer seemed like an event waiting to be understood. It was simply part of the plant now, pale among the older greens, exactly where the earlier note had said it would be after the evening warmth. That observation belonged in the handover. Mara did not take out her notebook to record it yet. She let the words remain simple in her mind. Fig leaf open as expected. Then she continued. The thought gave her a small, private ease. At the beginning of the shift, each doorway had seemed to mark a separate task. She had carried the keys from one place to another with the careful concentration of someone learning a new arrangement. The labels had helped. So had the lamps, the door latches, and the objects left on shelves and tables. Every small thing had pointed toward the next thing. Now the route did not feel like a list. It felt like one place with several rooms. Mara passed the potting room doorway. Daylight lay inside with a plain, useful calm. The room had its work table, its brush, its stacked pots, and the familiar scent of dry clay and old soil. She did not enter. The room was ready for the day's work, and that readiness did not depend on her making it look ready again. Potting table, clear. That could remain among the checklist marks rather than the handover note. Elias did not need every observation repeated in a second form. A useful handover could be brief. It could mention what had changed during the night and leave the settled routine to the checks already written on the page. Mara walked on until she reached the citrus house threshold. The door remained at its small, usual opening. Warm air passed gently through it into the glass walk, carrying the clean sharpness of orange leaves and the softer scent of dry wood. Behind the doorway, the small trees stood quietly in their tubs. Mara rested her fingers against the door without moving it. She had already looked around the room. The watering can was where it belonged, the chair was tucked in, and the table was clear. More than that, she had reached the point at which she could leave a room without feeling that attention must be proved by another look. She remained at the threshold only long enough to feel the mild warmth and notice the muted color of the oranges on the table. Citrus house, ready. The words were true, but they did not need to become a formal declaration before the entrance had received its final setting. Mara kept that distinction clear. The rooms had been checked, the lamps were off. The final route was nearly complete. The outer door, however, was still closed and latched. She turned back toward the entrance hall. The return felt shorter, though her pace had not changed. The glass walk passed beneath her steps in one familiar sequence, the citrus warmth receding behind her, the fig house coolness near the opening, the potting room with its dry scent, the bench and folded cloth, and then the firmer lines of the hall ahead. Her steps became quieter as the dark blue tiles drew nearer. Mara entered and let the familiar coolness of the entrance hall settle around her. The outer door stood exactly as she had left it, closed and latched in its frame. Beyond the glass, the last low fog rested near the hedge. The covered threshold was clear, and the damp gravel path curved visibly toward the gate. She went to the narrow ledge beneath the notice board and took out her notebook. It opened easily to the page she had used during the round. Beneath the heading she had written in the citrus house, the completed checks formed a plain sequence in her own handwriting. Final round. Entrance path visible. Mat flat. Citrus path clear. Watering tray dry. Fig house path clear. Potting table clear. Fern path clear. Drainage clear. Seed drawers closed. Table clear. Observatory roof closed. Floor clear. Lamps off. Mara read the list without moving closer. The lines were not impressive. They did not need to be. They gathered the night's work plainly, one ordinary fact after another. Below them, there was still room for the handover. She slipped the pencil from the notebook's spine and rested its point on the paper. For a moment, she considered the few things Elias would need when the day became his part of the conservatory. The round completed without anything requiring further attention. The young fig leaf open as expected. The soil settled. The rooms prepared for their usual use. Mara began the note. Elias' final round complete. Fig leaf open as expected. Soil settled. She paused there. The pencil remained in her hand. The sentence was not yet finished, and the entrance had not yet been given its morning's setting. That was as it should be. She had gathered the observations. She had taken the last familiar route. Now the final two pieces of the handover could be completed in their proper order. First the entrance latch. Then the last plain words on the page. Mara set the pencil gently across the open notebook, keeping her place. The keys remained in her pocket, their weight modest and known. Behind her, the conservatory held its own familiar arrangement of leaves, shelves, tools, glass warmth, and cool air. The lamps were off, and daylight continued quietly along the paths. Ahead of her, the outer door waited in its frame, still closed and still latched. Mara turned toward it without hurry. The note rested unfinished on the ledge, ready for its final line. The entrance waited for its final setting, and Mara stood between the two small tasks, calm and capable, with the return path understood beneath her feet. Mara remained in the entrance hall, between the open notebook and the outer door. Morning had reached the conservatory without any clear dividing moment. The darkness had thinned, the lamps had given way to daylight, and the fog beyond the glass had drawn back from the nearest stretch of path. Now the blue tiles held a quiet, even light. The notice board, the labeled switches, and the narrow ledge beneath them all looked plain and familiar. On the ledge, the notebook lay open where she had left it. The pencil rested across the page beneath the unfinished note. Elias, final round complete. Fig leaf open as expected, soil settled. The entrance door still stood closed and latched in its frame. Mara looked through its glass. The covered threshold was dry. Beyond it, the pale gravel curved between damp garden beds, clear now to the gate. A little fog remained near the hedge, no more than a soft gray band beneath the returning green. Moisture held along the iron rail in a narrow line. Only the final setting of the entrance remained. Mara placed her hand on the latch. The metal was cool beneath her palm. She lifted it slowly until it reached its morning position. The fitting moved with a quiet, familiar resistance and then rested there. She kept her hand on it for a moment. There was no need to open the door. Closed, it would keep the mild warmth of the conservatory inside a little longer. Unlatched, it would yield easily when the morning began and the first visitor placed a hand against it. Mara tested it with one light pressure. The door gave a fraction within its frame and settled back against it. The entrance was unlatched for morning. She withdrew her hand and stepped half a pace aside, leaving the doorway clear. The keys remained in her cardigan pocket. She had not needed to take them out or sort through their labels. Their familiar weight rested against the wool as she turned back to the ledge. The notebook waited open beneath the notice board. Mara picked up the pencil and read the unfinished note once. The 3 short statements already on the page were enough to carry the small change from night into day. The final round was complete. The fig leaf had opened as expected, and the soil was settled. She added the last plain words. Entrance unlatched for morning. Rooms ready. Then she stopped. There was nothing else Elias needed from her. No explanation belonged beneath the note, and no question had been left for him to answer. The rooms were ready in their ordinary ways, and the entrance had received its morning setting. Mara read the complete note once. Elias, final round complete. Fig leaf open as expected. Soil settled. Entrance unlatched for morning. Rooms ready. The pencil made a dry, gentle sound when she laid it across the paper. She had heard that sound throughout the shift, whenever a temperature, a lamp, or an ordinary observation needed recording. Here it was again, no louder than before. She closed the notebook carefully and returned the pencil to its spine. The notebook remained on the ledge where Elias would see it when he came in. Its cover lay flat beneath the clipped papers of the notice board. Below it, the labeled switches remained off. Mara let her hands rest loosely at her sides. Behind her, the conservatory was quiet in the morning light. She did not turn to inspect it again. The final round had already been walked. The routes had been checked, the lamps switched off, and the doors left at their usual openings. Another circuit would add nothing to the work. From where she stood, she could see the beginning of the glass walk. Daylight lay along the floor, where the lamps had made amber circles during the night. The corridor had not lost its shape when their light went out. It had simply taken on the pale, continuous light from the panes above. The narrow bench sat beneath the glass. The folded canvas cloth remained square on its shelf. The clay pots made low, still shapes in their tray. Farther along, the warmer opening of the citrus house and the quieter green of the fig house softened into the distance. None of it asked her to move closer. The blue tiles beneath her shoes were cool and firm. Her cardigan rested warmly around her shoulders. The keys in her pocket made a modest, known weight. The other pocket was empty now, and the notebook had been delivered to its proper place. Mara stood a little to one side of the outer door and listened without trying to separate every sound. Morning air moved faintly along the glass. A narrow thread of moisture traveled down one pane, somewhere beyond the entrance. A drop slipped from the iron rail to the damp earth below. The sounds arrived gently and faded into the larger quiet. The door remained closed beside her. Its latch stayed lifted. Through the glass, the nearest stretch of gravel had become a soft gray, darker where moisture still rested between the stones. The hedge beyond it was slowly returning to its ordinary green. Nothing outside changed quickly enough to mark a particular moment as the beginning of day. Light gathered at the threshold. It reached the edge of the entrance mat and rested in a pale rectangle across the tiles. The mat lay flat. Its dark fibers held no loose gravel, and its edges remained even against the floor. Mara watched the rectangle of light for a while. It did not seem to advance. It simply grew a little clearer as the fog thinned beyond the door. The dark blue tiles reflected the lower frame, and a faint suggestion of the glass above it. Behind her, the glass walk held a cooler light of its own. Warmth from the citrus house reached the passage in a mild current, too slight to stir her cardigan. The fig house kept its softer scent of leaves and damp soil. Farther away, the dry rooms remained still beneath their closed lamps. Mara did not need to name each room. She knew where she was. She knew that the outer door would open easily when morning required it, and that until then it could remain closed in its frame. She knew the notebook was waiting on the ledge, with the pencil secured through its spine. She knew the keys were with her and that the final note had been completed. These were enough. She shifted her weight slightly, from one foot to the other, and settled again. The movement made the keys touch softly in her pocket. Their labeled tags gave one muted tap and became still. Mara left her hand at her side rather than reaching for them. On the ledge, the notebook's plain cover caught a little of the growing daylight. The papers above it remained clipped to the notice board. Their lower edges hung without movement. Beneath them, the switch labels were easy to read, though Mara had no reason to read them now. The lamps were off. The entrance was unlatched. The note was finished. Her part of the opening checklist had reached its end. Mara allowed that fact to rest without adding to it. She did not need to make another mark on the page, or look once more along the route. The work had become complete through the small acts themselves. A switch pressed, a path observed, a latch lifted, a few useful words left behind. She took one slow breath. The entrance hall smelled faintly of cool tile, damp garden air, and the greener warmth carried from the rooms behind her. Nothing in the mixture was strong. The scents rested together as quietly as the morning light. Beyond the glass, moisture continued to shine along the rail. One droplet lengthened and slipped away. Another remained in its place. The last of the fog stayed low near the hedge. Mara looked neither for the gate nor for anyone approaching it. The path was clear, and that was all the morning required of the view. When the first visitor came, the entrance would be ready. Until then, the conservatory could remain in this settled pause between the night's tending and the day's ordinary use. She stepped another half pace away from the door. The doorway remained open and clear before her, though the door itself stayed closed. There was room for a hand to find the latch, and for the door to move inward without meeting anything on the tiles. Mara stopped there. She did not go back toward the glass walk. The route was understood beneath her feet, and the rooms did not need another visit. The conservatory could hold its own temperatures now. The mild warmth could remain among the orange trees. The cooler passage could carry the scents of damp stone and leaves. The fig house could keep its green shade around the young plant and its newly opened leaf. The leaf required no further attention. It had opened as expected. Mara had observed it and left it undisturbed. The fact now rested in the notebook for Elias, as simple as the settled soil beside it. She looked once at the closed cover on the ledge. The handover was complete. Elias would find the note when the day's work became his. He would not need to search for its meaning. The lines were brief, and every item had already been brought to rest. Mara turned her gaze back to the outer door. The pale path beyond it seemed almost level with the light on the tiles. Glass divided the two spaces, but the morning gathered on both sides. Inside, the air remained mild. Outside, the damp garden waited in its quiet gray and green. She let her shoulders settle beneath the cardigan. Her hands remained still. The keys rested in her pocket. For a time, nothing changed except the light. It became a little clearer along the threshold, a little softer on the notice board, and a little more even down the glass walk. The shapes of the bench and shelf remained where they were. The warm color at the citrus house doorway stayed low and muted. The fig house opening held its quiet green. Mara no longer followed the light from object to object. She simply stood within it. The conservatory had been tended through the night because its rooms needed different kinds of steady care. Now that care had passed into its morning form, paths clear, lamps off, rooms ready, one entrance unlatched, there was nothing left to finish. No further decision waited in the hall. No last task had been hidden beneath the familiar ones. The notebook held the final note. The door held its morning setting. The rooms behind her remained comfortably themselves. Mara breathed in the mild scent of damp air reaching through the edges of the closed door. Then she breathed out and stayed where she was. Outside, moisture shone on the iron rail. Inside, pale daylight rested across the dark blue tiles. The entrance door stood closed but clearly unlatched, ready for the first ordinary push of morning. Mara remained safely beside it, calm and capable, while the night conservatory settled into day.